Hey there. Tonight we're going way back, not to marble palaces or thunderbolts in the sky, but to the old myths told under open stars, to the labours, the legends, and the long winding story of a man who was strong, yes, but also lost, flawed, and deeply human. This isn't a tale of glory shouted from mountaintops. It's one of burden, of effort, of endurance. The kind of quiet heroism that comes from simply carrying on. If stories like this help you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe. But only if it brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is. There's something strangely comforting about seeing all the places where these quiet stories reach. So, dim the lights. Settle in. Let your thoughts slow. And let's begin at the beginning of a myth that somehow still matters. Let us begin gently with a tale as old as temples and twilight, one nestled in the fold of myth, embroidered with the silk of ancient superstition, and dusted lightly, as ever, with the fingerprints of mortal confusion. This is the story of Hercules, or, if you're partial to the Roman stylings, Hercules. But let us not rush. After all, you're likely listening to this in bed, and no one ever stormed Olympus with a yawn. Our tale begins not in the heavens but on earth, in the city of Thebes, though even that name carries the usual haze of mythological vagueness. There, a mortal woman named Alcmene lived. She was of noble blood, patient temperament, and, crucially, married. Her husband, Amphitryon, was away at war, which in Greek mythology was always a bit like leaving the windows open in a thunderstorm. Something unexpected was bound to sneak in. Enter Zeus. Or rather, descend Zeus, king of the gods. Storm-wielding, beard-flowing, nymph-pursuing Zeus, whose marital fidelity could best be described as conceptual. Now, Zeus had taken a liking to Alcmene, not because she sought divine company, but because she didn't. And as Greek myth goes, that was practically an invitation. Zeus disguised himself as Amphitryon, returning from war a bit earlier than scheduled, and spent the night with Alcmene. He even stretched the night into 3, manipulating time as only a thunder god can, which seems excessive even by divine standards. Alcmene, unsuspecting, believed it was her husband, and thus the seed of a demigod was planted. The next morning, the real Amphitryon arrived. Understandably, Alcmene was confused. Amphitryon too was puzzled when she congratulated him on their romantic evening, which he hadn't yet had. Eventually, the truth unravelled like a poorly spun thread, and the whole affair, as one might expect, upset quite a few people. But none so much as Hera. Ah yes, Hera, Queen of Olympus, wife of Zeus, long-suffering, sharp-eyed, and understandably furious, though rarely at the correct target. Her fury was rarely levelled at Zeus himself. Instead, it fell upon the women he pursued and the children born from these celestial indiscretions. And in this case, it fell squarely upon the unborn Hercules. Now let's pause for a moment of historical context. The Greeks believed their gods were not omnipotent in the way later religions framed divinity. The Olympians had strengths, yes, but also failings, pettiness, jealousy, and a distressing lack of conflict resolution skills. They were, in essence, a divine soap opera, and Hera played her role with unmatched theatrical flair. When Hera learned of Alcmene's pregnancy, she did not simply fume in silence. No, she sought to prevent Hercules' birth altogether. she persuaded her daughter Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, to delay the labour indefinitely. Alcmain, poor woman, was stuck in a loop of eternal contractions, an agonising magical stalemate. Fortunately, her servant Galanthis tricked Eileithyia by shouting that the child had been born, startling the goddess into loosening her spell. And thus Hercules entered the world. From the very beginning, he was no ordinary child. For one, he was enormous. Infant Hercules was said to have the strength of many grown men and the appetite of a small army, a rather inconvenient combination in a nursery. Hera, still determined to ruin his existence, devised another plan. One day, she sent 2 serpents into his cradle. Presumably, she hoped for a quiet assassination. But the infant, as the myth goes, grabbed one snake in each hand and strangled them. When his nurse returned, she found him gurgling contentedly, the serpents hanging limp like discarded toys. This story is one of the earliest recorded in the Hercules cycle, and it appears in vase paintings and early classical literature. One amphora from around 520 BCE shows Hercules gripping the snakes with exaggerated ease, while spectators stand aghast. Scholars suggest the tale served a dual purpose, entertaining the masses and illustrating divine strength from the very cradle. It also set the tone for what was to come. Hercules' life, from infancy to eventual apotheosis, will be a long negotiation between divine favour and divine punishment. He was beloved and reviled, blessed and cursed, the perfect mythological contradiction. Now, Hercules was not an only child. Alcmain bore another son, Iphicles, sired by her actual husband, Amphitryon. So the household had twin boys, one divine, one mortal. You can imagine family dinners were slightly awkward. Iphicles, though brave and noble in his own right, would always live in his brother's formidable shadow. The Greeks, ever fond of metaphors, used this duality to explore themes of fate, lineage, and the blurry lines between man and god. Let us drift now to Hercules' childhood. As a youth, he was tutored by the finest minds in Greece. Chiron the centaur, wise and gentle, taught him medicine and music. Linus, a stern music master, tried to teach him the lyre, a standard part of noble education at the time. Unfortunately, Hercules had little patience for scales, and even less for correction. When Linus struck him for a mistake, Hercules responded by striking back, with a lyre. The incident ended tragically, and Hercules was sent into exile for manslaughter. Greek legends are replete with such educational mishaps. Despite the setback, Hercules grew in strength and stature. He hunted lions, wrestled centaurs, and completed feats that would put any modern gym regimen to shame. One particularly early exploit included defeating a lion ravaging the plains of Ciphaeron. He wore its skin thereafter, the same pelt often confused with the Nemean lions in later tales. Hercules was also known for his appetite, not just for food, but for experience. He drank deeply from the cup of life, often to the alarm of those nearby. One anecdote tells of him single-handedly finishing an entire banquet before the other guests had even arrived. Whether true or not, it cemented his image as larger than life in every conceivable way. Yet he was not without fault. His temper, especially, was both legendary and dangerous, a flaw that would follow him throughout his life. The most tragic result of this flaw came in early adulthood. Hera, ever the patient strategist, struck again, not with serpents but with madness. One day, under her influence, Hercules lost all sense of reality. In his madness, he killed his wife Megara and their children. The grief, when he recovered his senses, was all-consuming. He sought penance in the only way the Greeks knew how: purification through suffering. At the Oracle of Delphi, he begged for guidance. The Pythia, speaking the will of Apollo, instructed him to serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns and perform a series of labours. Tasks so immense, they were considered nearly impossible. Only through this penance could Hercules cleanse the stain of his past and earn immortality. But that is a tale for another chapter. Historically speaking, the Greeks did not simply invent Hercules out of whole cloth. He may have originated as a hero in Mycenaean times. His name appears in Linear B tablets from the Bronze Age, spelled as Heracles. Over the centuries, his legend expanded and shifted, adapting to each generation's needs. In the 5th century BCE, Athenian playwrights portrayed him as a tragic figure, while the Romans later transformed him into a symbol of imperial strength. He was also worshipped, not just told of in taverns and epics, but honoured in sanctuaries and festivals. The cult of Heracles had real-world followers who left offerings at temples, prayed for protection, and even ran athletic games in his name. The Olympic Games themselves, while officially tied to Zeus, sometimes included tributes to Heracles as a mythic founder. Heracles also appears frequently in Etruscan art, often bearing the name Hercle. His figure stood as a bridge between mythologies, adopted and reinterpreted across the ancient Mediterranean. He became the model of the strong man who triumphs through suffering, a theme that resonated across centuries. And so, we close this chapter where it all began, in a cradle, with a baby who squeezed serpents and never quite knew peace. Born of gods and raised among mortals, Hercules began life as a contradiction wrapped in muscle and prophecy. He would go on to fight monsters, cross into the underworld, and die in agony upon a funeral pyre. But not yet. For now he sleeps. As I hope do you. Let us pick up our tale not in glory, but in grief. For before Hercules became the world's most famously employed hero, he first had to fall, hard, tragically, and publicly. This chapter, gentle listener, begins with madness. Divine madness, to be precise. The sort that creeps in not with the rustle of leaves or a storm on the horizon, but with the quiet whisper of a goddess holding a grudge. When last we left Hercules, he had grown into a towering figure, both in myth and in muscle. Strength unmatched, appetite legendary, beard doing most of the work at parties. He had married Megara, a princess of Thebes, and by most accounts was settling into the domestic rhythm of noble life. Perhaps even, dare we suggest it, happiness. This was of course unacceptable to Hera. The Queen of Olympus, still smarting from her husband's extracurricular siring of demigods, waited. Hera never forgot. Nor, it must be said, did she forgive. It wasn't long before she struck again. This time she used no serpents or tangled spells. She used madness, the most insidious of divine weapons. One moment Hercules was at peace. The next, the world became an unbearable shifting nightmare. Hera drove Hercules mad. Temporarily, yes, but devastatingly so. In his confusion and fury, he mistook his wife and children for enemies. What followed was not a battle, it was a massacre. By the time he returned to his senses, the palace was silent, his family gone. The horror of it shattered him. And so, the strongest man in Greece fell not in war, but in his own home. felled not by enemy spear, but by a god's whispered curse. The Greeks called this ate, a ruinous madness sent by the gods. It was not simply misfortune, but a moment of divine reckoning. Even heroes, it seemed, were not safe from collapse. Let us pause here, as the Greeks did, to consider the implications. In myth, this was not merely a tragedy. It was a moral reckoning, a cosmic balancing. The Greeks believed strongly in miasma, the pollution of the soul after such acts. Hercules, polluted by his crime, could not simply carry on. No feast, no prayer, no apology could erase such a stain. He needed purification. And purification, for a Greek hero, was never gentle. He travelled, broken and barefoot, to Delphi, where the oracle of Apollo sat cloaked in smoke and mystery. It was she, through divine inspiration, who prescribed the cure, servitude. Specifically, Hercules was to serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns for 12 years. Eurystheus, it must be said, was not the sort of man you'd hope to meet in a moment of personal crisis. Small of stature, large of ego, and arguably over-fond of reclining while others laboured, Eurystheus was a petty cousin of Hercules. And thanks to a twist of fate and a bit of Hera's meddling, it was Eurystheus, not Hercules, who inherited the throne of Mycenae. Being tasked to serve this particular man was a humiliation in itself. But that was the point. The Greek idea of catharsis, of cleansing, was not about dignity. It was about humility, suffering, and the slow climb back toward honour. And so, the 12 labours were born. But before we catalogue those feats of might and misery, let us linger here just a bit longer. Because this chapter, this fall into madness, is foundational. It tells us that Hercules was not merely a brute force character. He was a man who had erred deeply, who had suffered consequences, and who had to earn his place, not through birthright, but through ordeal. Megara, by the way, is a figure often lost in the shadow of her husband's legend. In some versions, she was spared the slaughter, living in exile, or retreating to her father's kingdom. In others, her fate is final. Greek mythology, true to its oral tradition roots, is not a single narrative but a tapestry, frayed, knotted, and rewoven across generations. Heracles' crime appears in Euripides' tragedy Hercules, a dark and powerful play that explores not only madness but the crushing aftermath. In it, Heracles returns from the underworld only to find that his family has been threatened by a tyrant. He saves them, only to be struck mad by Hera, slaughtering those he just rescued. When he awakens, he contemplates suicide. It is his friend Theseus who persuades him to live, not as a god, but as a man who must endure. This theme, endurance, is key. Greek heroes were not saints. They were not meant to be. They were instead mirrors of human struggle writ large. Courage wasn't the absence of failure. It was the willingness to rise again after falling. And what of Hera? It's tempting, of course, to cast her as the villain, and in the context of Hercules' life, she certainly seems antagonistic. But Hera's wrath, too, has context. In a world where divine men chased mortal women with alarming frequency and no consequences, Hera's fury is a kind of divine protest. Misplaced, yes. Misguided, certainly. But also perhaps the only weapon available to a queen in a court of thunderous egos. The theme of divine madness as a tool of punishment runs deep in Greek thought. Even outside mythology, historical accounts reference dreams, visions, and sudden frenzies as forms of divine intervention. In this case, Hera weaponizes the very fabric of Hercules' mind, not merely to destroy his family, but to force him into a lifelong cycle of guilt and redemption. There are visual echoes of this moment in ancient Greek vase art. A particularly striking red figure crater from the 5th century BCE shows Hercules in a wild, almost ecstatic frenzy. His face distorted, weapons flailing, surrounded by fallen forms. Scholars debate whether it depicts this episode, but the intensity of emotion, the divine storm within, is unmistakable. His descent into madness also invites comparisons with other mythic figures. Ajax the Great, for instance, another hero who succumbs to madness and slaughters livestock, believing them to be his enemies. When he realizes the truth, he takes his own life. But Hercules, for all his suffering, chooses the harder path, to live. After his consultation at Delphi, Hercules submitted to his fate. The next 12 years of his life would be defined not by his lineage, nor by his ambitions, but by his obedience to a cousin who couldn't have lifted his lion pelt if he tried. The irony would not have been lost on the Greeks. It was meant to sting. Hercules was not sent to war or handed a sword. He was given a list. The labours that would follow, slaying, fetching, cleaning, capturing, each came with its own trap, its own sting in the tail. Some were meant to humiliate, others to kill, and all of them were intended to break him. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. There is, in fact, a faint but curious echo of this structure in modern literature and cinema. The hero who falls, the self-imposed exile, the slow path to redemption. From Arthurian knights to Shakespearean kings, from comic book titans to tragic anti-heroes, the blueprint is still there. And it begins so often with a fall not from battle, but from within. Even in early Christian traditions that emerged later, echoes of Hercules' arc can be found. The notion that redemption is earned through suffering, that strength lies not only in might, but in submission, in endurance, in service. Hercules' later worship often emphasized this redemptive arc. At sanctuaries in places like Thebes and Thasos, votive offerings often included miniature clubs and lion skins, symbols not just of strength, but of trials overcome. Pilgrims prayed not for ease, but for the strength to endure difficulty, just as Hercules had. His myth inspired the Stoics of the Roman period too. The philosopher Seneca referenced Hercules frequently, not as a brute, but as a moral figure. One who suffered nobly, who bore pain with grace, and who showed that virtue, in the end, could triumph over even divine spite. So if, by this point in the night, your eyes are heavy and the room quiet, let us leave Hercules in a moment of stillness. His past in ruins, his path unclear, his sandals dusty and the horizon distant, but not impossible. The labours await, and so, perhaps, does sleep. Let us return now to the crossroads of fate, where Hercules, cloaked in guilt and burdened by divine command, is about to begin what may be the most famous checklist in mythological history. The 12 labours of Hercules, epic in scope, improbable in detail, and oddly specific. Each one a test, each one a punishment, and each one stitched into the great tapestry of redemption. We begin with the arrangement itself. Hercules was ordered to serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns, not as a courtly guest or honoured cousin, but as a servant. And not just any servant. A servant doomed to carry out the most unmanageable, humiliating, and downright bizarre tasks the king could imagine. These labours, in a sense, were bureaucratic justice with a poetic twist. redemption by way of impossible errands. The first labour, the Nemean lion. This lion was not merely large, it was invincible. Its golden fur could not be pierced by arrow, blade or spear. Local villagers had resigned themselves to being an occasional snack. Hercules ventured into the lion's cave with nothing but a club and a clever mind. After realizing his weapons were useless, he wrestled the beast with his bare hands, ultimately strangling it. Then, in a moment of delightful practicality, he used the lion's own claw to skin it. From that point forward, he wore the hide as armour, a sartorial choice both symbolic and intimidating. A lion's pelt draped over his shoulders, the mane forming a makeshift hood, would become one of his most iconic attributes in classical art and statuary. Next came the Linnaean Hydra. The Hydra was a water serpent with 9 heads, or perhaps more depending on the storyteller, and for every head cut off, 2 grew in its place. A rather discouraging design feature. To make matters worse, it lived in a swamp near Lerna, and its breath was poisonous. Hercules attacked with sword and fire, while his nephew Iolaus burned the neck stumps before they could regenerate. Teamwork, it turns out, is a heroic quality too. Hera, watching from Olympus, was so annoyed she sent a giant crab to help the Hydra. Hercules crushed it. The gods later turned both monsters into constellations. Because even petty divine interference deserves a commemorative sky plaque. The third labour was far less glamorous, the Ceryneian hind. This golden-horned deer was sacred to Artemis and faster than any arrow. Hercules was not supposed to harm it, so he chased it, on foot, for an entire year. Yes, a year. Through forests, over mountains, across rivers. He finally captured it gently and explained the situation to Artemis, who, remarkably, allowed him to borrow it so long as he returned it unharmed. This episode is one of diplomacy rather than destruction, a reminder that not every feat need end in bloodshed. It also subtly displayed Hercules' persistence. Rarely does one encounter a monster that must be outwalked rather than outfought. Then came the Erymanthian boar. This creature terrorized the countryside, uprooting trees and flinging farmers. Hercules captured it by driving it into deep snow, another example of brains accompanying brawn. Upon returning, Eurystheus was so frightened by the boar that he hid in a large jar, a moment which, on ancient pottery, is rendered with considerable comedy. Even myth needs its slapstick. The motif of Eurystheus hiding in a pithos, a great clay vessel, would become a recurring joke in Athenian vase painting. One wonders how he managed to govern with such a skittish constitution. The fifth labour was deeply unpleasant, cleaning the Augean stables. King Augeas owned a vast herd of immortal cattle. Their stables hadn't been cleaned in decades. The result, as one might imagine, was less than fragrant. Hercules, showing ingenuity, rerouted 2 rivers to wash the stables clean in a single day. Unfortunately, because he had bargained for payment, Eurystheus disqualified the feat. Evidently, divine redemption cannot be monetized. Yet this labour marked a shift. Hercules was no longer merely a brute, but an engineer. The feat was cited centuries later by Roman authors as an example of problem-solving by force of nature. Labour 6, the Stymphalian birds. These were no ordinary birds. They had metallic feathers that could be launched like arrows and a call sharp enough to shatter glass. Hercules used a set of bronze castanets, provided by Athena no less, to startle them into flight, then shot them down with arrows. a solution both theatrical and effective. The scene was later depicted in mosaics and temple friezes, with Hercules mid-shot, surrounded by flocks of unnatural birds. Let us pause here for a moment. By this point in the saga, Hercules has proven not just his strength, but his adaptability. He solves problems with muscle and mind, with fire and music, with a stubbornness that verges on philosophical. Each task has added a layer to his myth: a golden hide, a nephew's loyalty, a river's cooperation. Labour 7, the Cretan bull. This majestic, ferocious beast had been sent by Poseidon, but King Minos had refused to sacrifice it. Bad manners, especially where sea gods are concerned. Hercules wrestled the bull and shipped it off to Eurystheus, who promptly let it roam free again, as one does with sacred livestock. Some believe this same bull would later be involved in the myth of the Minotaur, a narrative that, like all things Greek, folds in on itself like a well-baked spanakopita. The 8th labour, the mares of Diomedes. These were man-eating horses, truly. Hercules tamed them by feeding them their own master, Diomedes. The horses, possibly surprised by the dietary switch, became suddenly docile. Moral complexity aside, it worked. The horses were led away peacefully. In some versions, the horses were taken to Mount Olympus as a gift, though one suspects the gods had mixed feelings about the snack options. The 9th task was almost civilized, retrieving the girdle of Hippolyta. Hippolyta was queen of the Amazons and possessed a magical belt given to her by Ares. At first, she agreed to give it freely, but Hera, ever meddlesome, disguised herself and spread rumours that Hercules intended to kidnap the queen. A battle broke out. Hippolyta died, and Hercules took the belt. What could have been an easy trade became a tragic misunderstanding, one of many in his journey. The Amazons in turn became a recurring foil in Greek tales, both feared and admired, warriors from a world where power wore a different face. The 10th labour, the cattle of Geryon. Geryon was a 3-bodied giant who lived at the western edge of the world. Hercules had to travel beyond the known world, perhaps as far as Iberia, and retrieve the cattle. Along the way he built the Pillars of Hercules, modern-day Strait of Gibraltar, to mark his journey. He slew Geryon, stole the cattle and crossed the desert. At one point, annoyed by the heat, he shot an arrow at the sun. Surprisingly, the sun god Helios admired his boldness and gave him a golden cup to sail across the sea. One wonders how many sun gods today reward good archery with nautical gear. It's the kind of myth that walks the line between grandeur and absurdity, perhaps intentionally so. The 11th task, the apples of the Hesperides. These golden apples were guarded by nymphs and a dragon. Hercules did not even know where they were. He sought the help of Prometheus, then persuaded Atlas to retrieve the apples while Hercules held up the sky in his place. When Atlas tried to shirk his burden permanently, Hercules tricked him into taking it back. A rare moment where strength alone would not do. The weight of heaven, it seems, requires a little cunning. In artistic depictions, Hercules is often shown literally holding up the firmament. No small feat, even for someone who once strangled a lion with his bare hands. And, at last, the 12th labour, capturing Cerberus. The 3-headed hound of Hades was the gatekeeper to the underworld. Hercules descended into the realm of the dead, negotiated with Hades himself, and brought Cerberus to the surface without using weapons. Once presented, the fearsome creature was returned to the underworld as agreed. This task, crossing into death and returning again, elevated Hercules beyond mortal boundaries. He was no longer just a hero. He was now a figure who had faced death and emerged, snarling companion in tow, to complete his penance. With this final act, Hercules' labours came to an end. 12 tasks, each monstrous in its own way. Together they formed a mythological resume unmatched in antiquity. But more than that, they served a purpose. In completing them, Hercules purified himself, not only of his crime, but of his rage, his pride, and his grief. He had done the impossible not once, but a dozen times. And through it all, he grew not only as a hero, but as a figure worthy of worship. In ancient Greece, these tales weren't just stories. They were metaphors for life's struggles, its messes, its monsters, its misunderstandings. And Hercules, through blood and cleverness, showed that even the cursed can find redemption. His labours became a common reference in classical oratory, especially among Stoic philosophers. They pointed to his struggles as allegories for mastering passions and enduring hardship. The Roman poet Seneca even argued that Hercules' immortality came not from his divine parentage, but from his moral perseverance. Each labour wasn't just a feat, it was a facet of character. And so, by fire and blood, by river and sky, by lion and lyre and labyrinthine task, Hercules emerged transformed. Still flawed, still fated, but no longer fallen. So if your eyes are growing heavy, and your breath has slowed, rest easy, knowing that even the strongest among us must sometimes clean a stable, or chase a deer through the woods for a year. Strength, after all, is not just in the arm, but in the will to continue. Hercules had completed the 12 labours, not survived them, completed them. There's an important difference, for while survival is passive, completion implies intention, purpose, a stubborn commitment to seeing things through. And that, in essence, was what Hercules had proven. He wasn't just strong, he was relentless. Now, with his penance concluded, he stood before the world no longer a murderer in need of purification, but a legend in his own lifetime. His name, once burdened by guilt, now shimmered with mythic resonance. And yet, because this is Greek mythology, peace would not follow. What followed instead was fame. And fame, as it turns out, is a fickle beast. Hercules' story did not stop with his labours. In fact, in many ways, they were just the beginning. The Greeks, ever fond of a good sequel, filled his post-labour life with new feats, fresh tragedies, and a growing awareness that glory could be as heavy to bear as guilt. He returned to Thebes but did not stay. Whether due to shame, restlessness, or divine suggestion, he began wandering. And wherever Hercules wandered, tales followed. He fought battles, toppled tyrants, and rescued damsels with the practised ease of a man whose reputation had begun to precede him. One might say he was the original action hero, the ancient equivalent of a travelling blockbuster. Among his many lesser-known exploits was his role in the war between the Lapiths and the Centaurs. The Centaurs, as ever, had overindulged at a wedding feast and caused considerable mayhem. Hercules stepped in, club swinging, and scattered them. It's worth noting that the Greeks often used centaurs to represent unrestrained passions, so it's fitting that Hercules, a man in constant struggle with his own temper, would be cast as their opponent. Another tale places him in Troy, long before the wooden horse made its entrance. The city had been tormented by a sea monster, and Hercules, passing through as heroes tend to do, offered to save it in exchange for a gift, often a royal daughter. He defeated the monster, only to be betrayed by the king, Laomedon. Naturally, Hercules returned later, laid siege to the city, and exacted revenge. Greek myth is rarely subtle in its messages about honour. He fought alongside Jason and the Argonauts for part of their voyage, though his stint was brief. When his companion Hylas was abducted by nymphs, Hercules abandoned the quest to search for him, wandering the forest in grief. This moment stands out, not for its drama, but for its vulnerability. The mighty hero undone by affection. Whether romantic or fraternal, the bond between Hercules and Hylas was powerful enough to stop even a quest for the Golden Fleece. These stories, while thrilling, also served a cultural function. They filled in the mythic landscape. Hercules wasn't confined to a single location or epoch. He was pan-Hellenic, claimed by many cities, worshipped in diverse forms. His image adorned temples in Boeotia, Argos, and even Sicily. He appeared on coins, in statuary, and in countless amphorae, usually mid-swing, lion pelt flapping, beard blowing gallantly in the breeze. One story, often overlooked but particularly rich in symbolism, tells of Hercules challenging the river god Achelous for the hand of Deianira. Achelous, capable of changing form, battled Hercules in various monstrous guises. At one point, he became a bull. Hercules, unimpressed, snapped off one of the bull's horns. That horn became the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, a symbol of abundance and fertility. So not only did Hercules defeat a shape-shifting river, but he accidentally invented the most festive table decoration in history. In another tale, he rescued Prometheus, yes, the Titan himself. Bound to a rock by Zeus for stealing fire and giving it to mankind, Prometheus suffered the daily torment of an eagle feasting on his liver. Hercules passed by, took aim, and slew the eagle with a single arrow. A moment of liberation wrapped in divine rebellion. That one gesture reconciled Heracles with the Titans, made him a saviour of human ingenuity, and subtly positioned him not just as a servant of the gods, but as one willing to defy them for a just cause. But as his fame grew, so too did the complexity of his relationships. Fame has a tendency to invite envy, misunderstanding, and political entanglement, especially when gods are involved. Consider his time with Omphale, Queen of Lydia. Yes, a queen. And yes, Hercules served her. According to the myth, he was punished once again, this time for killing a guest. A serious breach of Xenia, the sacred law of hospitality. As penance, he was sold into servitude and bought by Queen Omphale, who had him perform domestic duties. He dressed in women's clothing while she wore his lion skin. To the Greeks, this story was both humorous and unsettling. It inverted expectations. The mighty Hercules, embroidering with silken thread. But perhaps that was the point. Greek myth often plays with dualities, man and beast, god and mortal, masculine and feminine. Hercules' time with Omphale was not just comic relief. It was a challenge to his identity. Could a man be strong and still submit? Could a hero, known for his violence, find value in humility? In some versions the answer is yes. In others, it's simply another anecdote, one that kept Athenian playwrights well employed. Then there were his marriages. Hercules was not monogamous by nature or by myth. After Megara, he married several more times, Deianira being the most famous of his later wives. But before we arrive at the final tragic union, it's worth mentioning one of his most tender stories, his rescue of Alcestis. Alcestis was the wife of King Admetus. When Admetus was fated to die young, she volunteered to die in his place. Hercules, arriving unaware of the household's grief, was appalled to learn what had happened. In a rare display of pure compassion, he descended to the underworld and wrestled death itself, Thanatos, until Alcestis was released. No labours, no orders. Just a hero choosing, for once, to do good for goodness' sake. He is also credited with founding cities, establishing festivals, and laying down the roots of culture wherever he went. Some Roman sources claim he established the worship of Zeus in Iberia. Others say he dug wells, built roads, and taught people how to train horses. The line between myth and civic propaganda blurs, as it so often does. Hercules became both a god of strength and a symbol of order, ironically, for someone whose early life was defined by chaos. Even the gods continued to interact with him. Athena remained a frequent helper, and Apollo, with whom he once quarrelled over a sacred tripod, eventually reconciled with him. That quarrel, by the way, ended with Zeus hurling a thunderbolt between them, a divine "enough, boys." Temples sprang up in his honour, festivals were held in his name. The Heraclea, a series of games and rites, took place in many Greek cities, and even later the Romans would adopt him as Hercules Victus, a patron of strength and military conquest. Statues depicted him not merely as a man of action, but as one of burden, leaning on his club, the weight of the lion's skin drooping like memory over his shoulders. He had become an emblem, a symbol of the balance between glory and fatigue. He was mortal, but more than mortal. He could fall into madness, yet rise to heroism. He could serve a queen in humility and still be the terror of monsters. His legend grew not because he was perfect, but because he wasn't. He contained contradictions. He contained us. And still, Hercules was not finished yet. The great arc of his story was still curving toward a final, fateful crescendo. The tragedy of Deianira and the poisoned robe, of love turned lethal, awaited. And beyond that, a funeral pyre, and the stars. But those, dear listener, are for another night. For now, let us linger in this chapter of wandering and renown. Let us rest beside the road with the hero, sit beneath an olive tree, and feel the dust of his journey still warm upon the breeze. He has earned, if not rest, at least remembrance. Sleep well, knowing that even those with divine strength must still live with human complexity. The labours of Hercules were, by this point, less a punishment and more a profession. One could almost imagine the hero sighing into his wine cup each evening, muttering, "What now?" as another impossible errand arrived by scroll. Having completed 6 tasks, including lion wrestling, swamp dwelling, and stable cleansing, one might think he'd earned a rest. But no. King Eurystheus, ever eager to find fault, declared that 2 of the completed labours didn't count. The Hydra, he claimed, had been a team effort. And the Augean stables? Well, Heracles had accepted a reward for that one. Payment apparently invalidated heroism. So, with bureaucratic pettiness firmly in place, the total number of labours rose from 10 to 12. And these final 6 were not the sort one could complete within a day's ride. No, they would take Heracles far beyond the borders of Greece, into mythic lands, forgotten corners of the world, and even to the murky gates of death itself. The first of these tasks was to capture the Cretan bull. a creature of divine origin and very poor temperament. The bull had once been sent by Poseidon to King Minos of Crete, who was meant to sacrifice it in honour of the god. But Minos, admiring its beauty, and perhaps seeing in it a fine addition to his personal menagerie, kept it for himself. This, as one might guess, did not please Poseidon, who promptly drove the beast mad. It trampled fields, smashed walls, and breathed fire in the general direction of anyone who looked at it the wrong way. Hercules, for his part, wrestled the creature into submission with little fanfare. He shipped it back to Eurystheus, who took one look at the furious snorting bull and dove head first into a large bronze jar, a habit he had been cultivating with some regularity. The bull was released into the wild, eventually settling near Marathon, where it continued to cause trouble for other heroes. Mythological pest control was, it seems, an ongoing business. The next task brought Hercules to Thrace, land of cold winds and warlike tribes, where a particularly grim figure named Diomedes kept a stable of horses. Now, horses are typically not man-eating creatures, but these were special. Trained to devour the flesh of prisoners and enemies, Diomedes' mares were a grisly innovation. Some versions say they breathed fire, others that they were simply unnaturally vicious. Either way, Hercules was instructed to steal them. He set off with a few companions and did battle with the king's men. The climax of the tale is dark. Hercules, in a moment of grim practicality, fed Diomedes to his own horses. One assumes the moral was something about poetic justice, or, more cynically, about the effectiveness of feeding troublesome monarchs to their own carnivorous livestock. In any case, the horses calmed down significantly after that. Eurystheus, predictably horrified, wanted nothing to do with them and let them loose. Next came a rather awkward diplomatic mission. Eurystheus' daughter had expressed a desire for a gift, the girdle, or belt, of Hippolyta, Queen of the Amazons. The belt was no ordinary fashion accessory. It symbolized the queen's authority and divine favor, said to have been given to her by Ares himself. Hercules approached with what was, initially, admirable restraint. Hippolyta, impressed by his honesty, or perhaps charmed by his muscles, agreed to give him the belt. But Hera, as ever, had other plans. Disguised as an Amazon, she spread rumours that Hercules intended to kidnap their queen. Tensions rose. The Amazons attacked. Amid the confusion, Hippolyta was killed, either by Hercules, mistaking her for an attacker, or by her own people. Thus ended what might have been a rare moment of peace. Hercules took the belt and sailed home. One could almost hear him muttering, "Couldn't just go smoothly, could it?" Then came the cattle of Geryon, a rather complicated affair. Geryon was a three-bodied giant who lived on an island far to the west, past the reaches of the known world. His cattle were of a particularly fine breed, tended by a herdsman and guarded by a two-headed dog named Orpheus. Hercules, needing transport, borrowed a golden cup from the sun god Helios. Yes, a literal cup, and used it to sail across the great Western Ocean. The Greeks, to their credit, were never shy about narrative scale. Upon arrival, Hercules dispatched Orpheus, the herdsman, and finally Geryon himself, with arrows tipped in hydra venom, naturally. Then began the long journey back, herding the cattle across continents, while fending off raiders, thieves, and divine sabotage. Hera, still committed to making Heracles' life difficult, sent gadflies to scatter the herd. Heracles, exasperated but dutiful, rounded them up again. One imagines this was not among his favourite labours. The penultimate trial took Heracles to the fabled garden of the Hesperides, a paradise at the edge of the world, where golden apples hung from trees, grown as a wedding gift from Gaia to Hera. These apples were not for snacking. They symbolized immortality and were guarded by a serpent with 100 heads named Ladon, as well as the nymph daughters of the evening star. Heracles didn't know where to find this place, so he did what any mythic hero would do. He found a sea god, wrestled him into submission, and demanded directions. Eventually, he sought out the Titan Atlas, who stood at the edge of the world holding up the sky. Heracles offered to take the burden, just for a little while, if Atlas would be so kind as to fetch the apples. Atlas, not surprisingly, agreed, and did so. But when he returned, he suggested he might deliver the apples himself, and leave Heracles to hold the heavens permanently. Heracles smiled, nodded, and asked if Atlas could just take the weight back for a moment while he adjusted his cloak. The Titan obliged. Heracles handed over the burden and walked off with the apples. Never underestimate a man who's fought a hydra, cleaned divine stables, and negotiated with immortal skybearers. He's learned a trick or two, and then the final task, one last labour. Heracles was told to descend into the underworld, not metaphorically, but literally, and return with Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guarded the gates of Hades. Unlike his other tasks, this one involved no theft, no slaying, no deception. He had to ask for permission. Heracles entered the land of the dead, passed the ghosts of fallen heroes, and approached Hades and Persephone with what we might call exceptional manners. They agreed on one condition: he must subdue Cerberus without using weapons, and so he did. With only his bare hands and strength forged by 11 impossible tasks, Heracles wrestled Cerberus into submission and led him, snarling and snapping, into the world above. Eurystheus, now quite practiced in theatrical terror, reportedly fainted. Heracles returned the hound to its post at the gates of the underworld, unharmed and likely unimpressed by the mortal realm. At long last, the 12 labours were complete. Heracles had faced monsters, gods, queens and beasts. He had travelled beyond the edges of maps and returned, not only alive, but cleansed of his sins. These trials, crafted by a cowardly king and stirred by a vengeful goddess, had made him into something more than mortal. His name would echo through temples, amphorae, epic poetry, and, eventually, Saturday morning cartoons. But this, dear listener, was not the end of Heracles' story. Far from it. The labours had redeemed his soul, but his mortal life would still be marked by struggle, sorrow, and final transformation. For no Greek hero gets to rest quietly. Not even the strongest of them all. Heracles, having completed his 12 labours, should by all rights have settled into a quiet retirement. Perhaps a small olive grove, a modest villa, and a dog that didn't have 3 heads. But no, this was ancient Greece, where peace was temporary and rest was for the dead. And even then, not always. The truth is, the labours had never been meant to bring Heracles peace. They were atonement, punishment, perhaps even public spectacle. 12 grand efforts to scrub the blood from his hands, yes, but not to soften his path thereafter. He had cleansed himself of the madness that led to the death of Megara and their children, but he had not unburdened himself of fate. and so he remained. Strong, restless, and perhaps, deep down, a little lost. With his divine strength intact and his name known across the Mediterranean, Heracles took to wandering. Not in the lazy sandals in the sand sense of wandering, mind you, but as a relentless figure of myth and muscle. He became something between a mercenary and a demigod in residence, hired by kings, revered by the desperate, occasionally feared by those who had reason to doubt his restraint. He fought battles not listed among his labours, wars not sung about in epic poems. He toppled tyrants, hunted monsters, and even founded cities. Or so the stories go. It's difficult, of course, to know where the real Heracles ends and the embroidered myth begins. But perhaps that was always the point. He ventured far beyond the Greek mainland, to Libya, where he is said to have bested Antaeus, a giant who could not be defeated so long as he remained in contact with the earth. Heracles, with practical brilliance, lifted him into the air and crushed him. A fine metaphor, if you like, for learning to outwit even the most grounded adversary. He travelled to Egypt, where one story claims a certain King Busiris attempted to sacrifice him, only to be sacrificed himself in short order. Heracles was not fond of surprises. He journeyed to the northern forests and the shores of the Black Sea, places where even Greek sailors whispered of cold winds and stranger gods. He was, in many ways, the first truly pan-Hellenic hero, a figure whose legend expanded with every ship that left port and every tale told over wine. Local myths absorbed him like water into sponge. In Egypt, he was associated with Hereshaph, a warrior god with strength and regal bearing. In Phoenicia, they connected him to Melkart, and in Italy, the Etruscans began to whisper his name in their own rights. The Romans, of course, would claim him fully, Latinizing his name to Hercules and casting him in the image of empire itself. Strong, noble, enduring, and always just a touch too prone to violence. But even heroes get lonely. And so it was that Heracles returned briefly to the subject of marriage. He set his sights on a woman named Deianira, a princess of Calydon, known for her beauty, wit, and a certain spirited independence. But winning her hand was not without difficulty. She had another suitor, the river god Achelous, a shape-shifting deity who argued quite reasonably that he had seniority, divinity, and far fewer episodes of public chaos in his past. But Heracles, never one to lose a contest, challenged him outright. The two fought in a contest of strength and form. Achelous turned into a snake. Heracles squeezed him. Achelous became a raging bull. Heracles broke off one of his horns. That horn, in time, would become the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, symbolizing abundance. It's rather poetic that one of the most enduring icons of harvest and feast began as the snapped horn of a god defeated in a suitor's duel. Heracles and Deianira married, and for a time there was peace. They lived in Calydon, and he, for once, appeared content. But peace, as always, was fleeting. A dispute arose, as it always seems to, when mortal politics and divine legacy meet. The couple left Calydon, setting out to start anew elsewhere. And it was during this journey that tragedy began to trail them once more. At the banks of a river, swollen, fast-moving, they encountered a centaur named Nessus. Nessus offered to ferry Deianira across while Heracles swam. This was not unusual. Centaurs, though often unruly, were sometimes employed for such tasks. But Nessus had darker intentions. Midway through, he attempted to abduct Deianira. Hercules, on the opposite bank, saw what was happening. Without hesitation, he drew his bow and loosed an arrow, one tipped, as always, with the venom of the Hydra. The arrow struck true. Nessus collapsed, mortally wounded, but with his final breath, he turned his defeat into something far more sinister. He told Deianira, calmly, persuasively, that his blood, now mingled with the pain of love denied, could be used as a charm. If ever she feared Hercules might stray, a robe soaked in this blood would bind his heart to hers. It was a lie, of course. The blood was now tainted with the lethal venom that had killed so many beasts before him. But she believed him. Years passed. The couple settled elsewhere. Hercules resumed his heroic wanderings, performing feats, receiving honours, and, occasionally, as with the young Princess Iole, letting his admiration show perhaps a bit too openly. Deianira, hearing whispers of his interest in Iole, panicked, not with anger, but with sorrow, and the kind of desperation only love and insecurity can brew. She remembered Nessus's words. She prepared a robe, as he had instructed, soaked in his blood, and sent it to her husband. Hercules, ever trusting, donned the gift. The moment the cloth touched his skin, it began. A pain unlike any he had known, and that is saying quite a lot, considering he had once hauled the sky on his shoulders. The venom worked quickly, seeping into his flesh, burning not like flame, but like betrayal. He tore at the fabric, but it would not release. The more he struggled, the more damage it did. His skin clung to it. His strength became meaningless. There is something profoundly human about that moment. The strongest man in myth, undone not by monster or blade, but by trust, by love, by the unintended cruelty of someone who meant him no harm. Hercules, realizing his end was near, climbed Mount Uta. He ordered a funeral pyre to be built. None would light it out of reverence or fear. Finally, a traveller, sometimes said to be Philoctetes, the archer, agreed. Hercules gave him his bow as thanks, a sacred weapon destined to play a role in the Trojan War. And then he lay down, surrounded by wood, and waited for the flames. As the fire consumed his mortal body, something remarkable occurred. His divine half, the essence inherited from Zeus, rose unscathed. He ascended to Olympus, shedding pain, memory, and all the weight of mortality. And there, in what might be mythology's most unexpected reconciliation, Hera welcomed him. The goddess who had hounded him since birth, who had tried to kill him with snakes in his cradle, accepted him into the heavens and gave him her daughter, Hebe, goddess of youth, as his bride. It is a tidy ending, perhaps too tidy. But myth is not meant to reflect fairness, only meaning. Hercules became a god. He was worshipped at shrines across Greece and beyond. Athletes prayed to him for strength. Soldiers invoked his name in battle. Ordinary men, facing hardship, remembered that even Hercules had suffered. He was no longer just a hero. He was a symbol of endurance, of redemption, of the long and painful path from error to forgiveness. His image appeared on vases, in temple carvings, in the minds of poets and orators. The Romans gave him temples. The Byzantines, later, would reinterpret him. And even today his story echoes. In comic books, in muscle-bound heroes on silver screens, in metaphors about impossible labours and the strength to carry on. For Hercules did not simply fight monsters. He fought himself. His impulses, his rage, his guilt. And in the end he emerged, scarred, burned, perhaps even a little wiser, but at peace, Not all heroes are crowned in olive leaves. Some are crowned in flame. Some find heaven not through purity, but persistence. And so we leave him, not on the pyre, not in Olympus, but somewhere in between, still walking, perhaps, in the twilight lands of memory. Still a figure of strength and sorrow, of justice and error. His labours are done. Yours, dear listener, are too. Close your eyes and sleep. The story of Hercules, one might think, had reached its divine conclusion. He had been granted immortality, welcomed to Olympus, and wed to Hebe, goddess of eternal youth. A fitting ending for a life stitched with pain, muscle, and flame. But Greek myth has never been particularly good at letting things lie. Even gods are restless, it seems. And though Hercules had ascended, stories of his deeds on earth continued to ripple outwards like aftershocks from a long-forgotten quake. You see, the Greeks did not confine their heroes to neat narrative boxes. They allowed them to stretch, to contradict, to reappear. And so Hercules, though now divine, remained curiously involved in mortal affairs. His cults grew. His adventures were expanded upon. Entire cities claimed his presence. And in many places, he was more than remembered. He was still active, a hero who, despite his apotheosis, never quite stopped moving. This chapter, then, is not a single tale. It's a patchwork of lesser-known stories, drifting between myth and cult, between whispered legends and formal ritual. Hercules the Errant, a god who could never quite stay put. To begin with, there is the curious matter of Hercules and Prometheus. Prometheus, as you may recall, had a rather unfortunate time after stealing fire for humanity. Zeus, in a mood perhaps best described as eternally displeased, chained him to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains. There, an eagle, large, persistent, and presumably quite satisfied with its career choice, devoured his liver daily, only for it to grow back again each night. This was divine punishment, with a certain gruesome poetry to it. And then one day Hercules came along. No grand motive is given. He was simply passing through, as gods and heroes often do in these tales, and found Prometheus still bound, still bleeding, still waiting. Hercules, ever practical, took up his bow and shot the eagle. Just like that. One arrow, then he broke the chains. Zeus, surprisingly, allowed it, perhaps moved by the heroic gesture, or perhaps simply tired of the entire affair. It is a striking episode. Hercules, the mortal turned god, liberating the titan who had championed mankind. Two rebels, meeting briefly at the edge of myth, one lifting the burden of the other. It's the kind of tale that doesn't roar. It hums. Quietly, persistently. Not long after, Hercules found himself embroiled in another conflict, this time against a certain King Laomedon of Troy. The king, as kings often are in Greek myth, was both proud and dishonest. He had promised Hercules a reward, horses, to be specific, if the hero would rescue his daughter Hesione from a sea monster. Hercules, of course, obliged. He slew the creature, saved the girl, and then was promptly told that the reward would not, in fact, be given. This was a mistake. Hercules returned later with an army, sacked the city, and killed Laomedon. In the chaos, he handed Hesione over to her choice of suitor. She picked Telamon, Hercules' comrade. Together they would become ancestors to Ajax, one of the greatest heroes of the Trojan War. Thus Hercules, inadvertently and indirectly, helped set the stage for a conflict at Troy, not by prophecy or divine manipulation, but by getting cheated out of some horses and deciding quite reasonably that he had better things to do than accept royal ingratitude. Another tale, less dramatic but no less telling, takes place in the land of Lydia. Here, Heracles entered into a curious period of servitude. He was, according to legend, sold as a slave to Queen Omphale. The reasons for this vary. Some say it was punishment for a murder, not his first nor his last. Others suggest it was a kind of penance, enforced by the gods to teach humility. What's more interesting is what happened during this period. Omphale, unlike most Greek queens, was not content to let a demigod stomp about smashing things. She put him to work, and not in the usual Heraclean fashion. He was made to do spinning, weaving, domestic chores. In some versions, she even dressed in his lion skin and carried his club, while Heracles wore her clothes and jewels. Now, one could view this as comic inversion, and certainly ancient vase painters had a field day with it. But there's something more here. A softening. A hero stripped of his tools, his temper, his public image. A glimpse of the man beneath the lion hide. Or perhaps, more accurately, a suggestion that heroism need not always roar. Sometimes it simply folds laundry. It's a reminder, too, of the Greek fascination with role reversal, with flipping the expected order of things, if only to see what happens. Omphale, strong and shrewd, ruling over the strongest man in myth. Heracles, still formidable, submitting not out of weakness, but out of something almost like curiosity. And then there were the small interventions. Tales too minor for epic, but too persistent to vanish. He helped the Argonauts, in some versions, though he did not complete the voyage. He was present at Calydon, though the spotlight was mostly on Meleager and the famous boar. He trained warriors, advised kings, and occasionally settled scores that no one else could. In Boeotia, he was said to have founded the Olympic Games, though that honour is also claimed by Pelops and even Zeus himself. Still, Heracles' presence at Olympia became fixed in the cultural imagination. Statues of him adorned the gymnasia. Wrestlers poured libations in his name before matches. He was not just remembered, he was present, invoked in the sweat and struggle of athletic glory. And in the Roman world, he was reinvented again. Hercules, as the Latin tongue called him, was no longer a rough-edged, guilt-haunted wanderer. He became a civic hero, a builder of temples, a protector of roads, a patron of trade. Merchants prayed to him for safe passage. Soldiers marched under his image. Emperors draped themselves in his iconography. Even Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, admired him, writing of strength and endurance in tones that echo the Heraclean model. But this was a different Heracles, polished, politic, smiling in marble. The raw, impulsive man who had once burned on a pyre was now a mascot of virtue. Still powerful, still noble, but, one might argue, slightly airbrushed, and yet he remained compelling. Across centuries, cultures, and reinterpretations, the figure of Heracles persisted. Not because he was perfect, quite the opposite, because he was human. For all his strength, he failed. For all his divinity, he doubted. He raged, loved, mourned, and tried again. His labours, enormous though they were, mirrored the smaller labours of ordinary life, tasks we repeat, endure, and one day finish. There is a temple to Heracles in Agrigento, on the southern coast of Sicily, or what remains of one. Its columns stand crookedly now. silent witnesses to thousands of years of wind and salt and sun. No one worships there anymore. But the stones are still warm in the summer light, and somewhere beneath the rubble a story breathes. It's a quiet one. A tale not of labours or monsters, but of a man who once tried to find peace. And perhaps, in the retelling, we find some of it too. For the true legacy of Hercules may not be his strength, or his fame, or even his immortality. It may be the fact that he never stopped moving, that he walked through sorrow and flame, across continents and centuries, and left behind a shape, a memory that says struggle is not failure, that toil is not defeat, that even the strongest must kneel and rise again. So let the myths continue. Let him appear where needed, in temples, in songs, in dreams. Let him remain the wandering god, the errant hero, the old friend we sometimes remember when things are hard. His club may be gone, but his footsteps remain. Close your eyes, dear listener, and rest. The story of Hercules, by this point, is less a single tale and more a collection of echoes, drifting across city-states, muttered in the shade of olive trees, inscribed on temple walls, painted onto pottery, and carried on the sea winds from one shore to the next. His 12 labours may be complete, but like any well-known figure, his legend didn't stop growing simply because he died, or, in his case, ascended into the company of gods. The Greeks were not particularly concerned with narrative neatness. Heroes returned in dreams, in cults, in songs sung over the coals of a dying hearth. And Hercules? Hercules returned most of all. In temples and rituals, in whispered prayers before athletic contests, in moments of fear, and occasionally, when no one expected it, as a very real presence. This chapter, then, tells of his final transformation, not just from man to god, but from living myth to living symbol. For even after his funeral pyre turned to ash, Hercules' work was far from finished. He had simply changed categories. It begins, fittingly, with Olympus. When Hercules arrived on Olympus, his mortal flesh seared away, his divine half risen, there must have been, one imagines, an awkward silence. Hera, queen of the gods and the eternal architect of his suffering, was not exactly known for forgiveness. After all, she had tried to kill him in his cradle. She had driven him mad. She had set monsters in his path with the same casual regularity that one might set wine on a table. And yet something shifted. Whether it was compassion, fatigue, or a grudging respect for a man who had, despite her best efforts, survived everything she threw at him, Hera accepted Hercules, not only into Olympus, but into her family. She gave him her daughter Hebe, goddess of youth, as a bride, and just like that, the old antagonism dissolved. Perhaps not into love, but at least into ceremony. The marriage of Hercules and Hebe served a symbolic purpose. He, the champion of mortal endurance. She, the personification of immortality. Together, they represented a kind of harmony, the triumph of human effort rewarded by divine favour. On Olympus, Hercules was a strange fit. Most of the gods lounged, plotted, or occasionally meddled with mortals for sport. Hercules, however, was a man of action, a creature of motion. Even among immortals, he was restless. He did not take easily to lounging on clouded thrones or sipping ambrosia while contemplating the nature of eternity. And so, unsurprisingly, he continued to intervene. There are stories of Hercules descending from Olympus to aid in battles. He appears to help heroes, to guide kings. to judge wrestling matches. His status was complicated. Not quite God, not quite ghost, not quite memory, but always there. In parts of Greece, especially in places like Thebes and Argos, Heracles was not just worshipped, he was invited. Shrines were built for him, sacrifices were made, and more unusually, rites were performed to call him down, to ask him to attend. These were not mere devotions, they were invitations for the god to return, to walk again among men, to protect them in moments of trial. One such rite, known as the Heracleia, was celebrated annually in many city-states. It commemorated his death, his burning, and his rebirth. Unlike most festivals for the gods, which emphasized their power and perfection, the Heracleia was about pain and triumph, about the long, scorched road to redemption. His cult grew, and with it, stories multiplied. Some claimed that Heracles now sat among the stars, his lion-skin cloak glittering in the firmament. Others said he walked the roads in disguise, helping travellers and punishing the wicked. And others still, especially the philosophers, began to see him not just as a figure of strength, but as a moral example. The Stoics in particular adored Heracles. To them, he was the embodiment of virtues, the Roman virtue of strength through discipline. Here was a man who had suffered, who had endured hardship after hardship, and who had chosen action over complaint, duty over despair. To live like Heracles was not to be invulnerable, but to be resilient. One philosopher, Musonius Rufus, once said that a man ought to strive for the same strength of character as Heracles, not the lifting of weights or slaying of beasts, but the courage to do what was necessary even when one soul trembled. In this way, Heracles became a bridge, not only between man and God, but between body and soul, between myth and philosophy. He became a kind of spiritual exercise, an ideal of suffering made meaningful by perseverance. The Romans, never ones to let a good god go to waste, adopted him wholeheartedly. They transformed Heracles into Hercules Victor, Hercules the Conqueror, a patron of soldiers, travellers, and merchants. Temples were raised to him in Rome, most notably the Round Temple in the Forum Boarium, where people came to pray for success in business and battle alike. Roman emperors adored the comparison. Commodus, that volatile and theatrical emperor, fancied himself a reincarnation of Heracles. He fought in the arena, dressed in lion skins, and had statues made in his image. It was, admittedly, not subtle. Others were more restrained. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, spoke often of endurance, and though he didn't claim descent from Heracles, the ideals he preached, calm, resolve, ethical action, echoed the Heraclean model in quieter tones. And so, over centuries, Heracles transformed again. He was a hero, then a god, then a symbol, a tale told to children, a prayer whispered by athletes, a statue softened by the rain. His strength remained, of course, always the club, the lion skin, the impossible biceps. But each strength began to mean something different. It wasn't just about violence or victory. It was about surviving, about the patience to carry burdens, the courage to atone, the strange grace of starting again. His image changed with the times. The early Heracles was wild-haired, wide-eyed, a man more beast than god. Later, in the Hellenistic age, he was shown older, heavier, more contemplative. Still strong, but now weary. A god who had known pain, a hero who had wept. And through all this, his labours were never forgotten. Artists returned to them again and again: the lion, the hydra, the stables, the apples. Each one became a metaphor: challenges to be overcome, trials to be endured, personal monsters in mythic disguise. They were painted onto drinking cups, etched into stone, told over and over at dinner parties and temple gatherings and public games. Not because they were entertaining, though they certainly were, but because they held something timeless, a structure, a promise, that if Hercules could do it, perhaps we could too. Not slay monsters necessarily, but endure the things life throws at us: grief, doubt, fatigue, shame, and emerge still walking, still trying, still ourselves. By the time Christianity began to rise in the Mediterranean world, Hercules had already faded somewhat from daily worship. The temples grew quiet, the sacrifices stopped, but the memory remained, and in curious ways it was absorbed. The image of a suffering saviour, carrying burdens not his own, descending to the underworld and rising again. One needn't stretch too far to see the shadows he cast across later sacred narratives. Even today, he's still with us. In the gym, where men and women push their limits under posters of muscled heroes. In literature, where flawed protagonists strive for redemption. In philosophy, where we are reminded that virtue is not born in comfort, but forged in fire. And in bedtime stories, where strength and sorrow dance side by side. Hercules, it seems, has never truly left. He simply changes shape. One day a statue, one day a star, one day a voice in your head telling you to get up and try again, even when everything aches. His labours are complete, but ours, in a gentler, quieter way, go on. So, rest now, dear listener. You've carried enough for today. And tomorrow. Well, tomorrow we face our own lions. But tonight you sleep. The name Hercules began as a whisper in the hills of ancient Greece, perhaps around a fire, or beneath the columns of a small local shrine. But it did not stay there. It travelled. Like a pebble dropped into still water, the story of the strong man who suffered rippled outward, and as those ripples moved across time and territory, something remarkable happened. He changed. This chapter tells of Hercules not as a singular figure bound to a single myth, but as a traveller, a god without a border, a hero with many names. It is the story of how Hercules, born of Alcmaeon and Zeus, slayer of beasts and lifter of burdens, became something more, a universal symbol, a shape that each culture, empire and age could mould into its own image, sometimes divine, sometimes absurd, always unforgettable. His journey begins, oddly enough, not in Greece, but from Greece, through its colonies, trade routes and ambitions. The early Greeks, even before Athens and Sparta became household names, were explorers. They set sail in small ships, hugging the coastlines, trading oil, wine and stories. And wherever they went, they brought Hercules with them. In North Africa, for instance, Greek settlers brought the tale of Hercules to Egypt. The Egyptians already had a pantheon full to bursting, gods with falcon heads, crocodile jaws, and solar discs. But Hercules, with his club and lion skin, did not seem out of place. In fact, they found him somewhat familiar. He became associated with Hereshaph, an older Egyptian deity, a creator god with ram's horns, worshipped at Heracleopolis. Yes, they renamed the city, Heracleopolis Magna, the great city of Heracles. In this Egyptian form, Heracles lost none of his power, but he gained a touch of majesty. No longer the wild, brawling hero of Greece, he became a figure of wisdom, even kingship, a god of renewal and rulership. It is always fascinating to watch how cultures, when handed the same myth, choose to interpret it not by its original logic, but by their own need. In the East, among the Persians and later the Indians, the Greeks introduced him as part of their imperial storytelling. After Alexander the Great swept across the known world, from Macedonia to the Indus River, he brought with him not only armies, but iconography, coins bearing the lion-headed visage of Hercules, temples with columns shaped like clubs. In India, some scholars believe Hercules may have influenced, or been conflated with, figures such as Vishnu or Krishna, particularly in the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms where Hellenic and Indian cultures overlapped. In Gandhara art, that haunting fusion of Greek realism and Buddhist serenity, we sometimes find figures who look suspiciously like Hercules, guarding stupas, standing beside bodhisattvas, lion skin slung casually across their shoulders. He had, it seems, become a guardian of thresholds, a protector, no longer wrestling monsters in the swamps of Argos, but keeping watch at the edge of enlightenment. And then there is the West, the Roman West, where Hercules truly reached his second life. The Romans, practical and deeply fond of useful gods, renamed him Hercules and made him a patron not just of strength, but of travellers, merchants, and military men. He was no longer a penitent figure trying to atone. He was a symbol of virtues, of active excellence, of triumph by effort. His club was less about violence now, and more about steadfastness. Temples to Hercules appeared in Carthage, in Spain, in Gaul, and across Britannia. Roman soldiers carved his name into altars along Hadrian's Wall. Even as far north as the Rhine and Danube, his story endured, a Mediterranean hero now clad in the mist of barbarian lands. He was not just a god, but a tool of empire. His labours became metaphors for imperial conquest. Just as Heracles had tamed the wild world in his myths, the boar, the lion, the stables, so too did Rome imagine itself taming the wilderness beyond its borders. But beneath the grandeur, Hercules still retained his complexity. Romans told jokes about him. They painted him in taverns, sometimes drunk, sometimes asleep, sometimes wrestling pigs instead of giants. He became, oddly enough, a figure of affection, more human than many of their distant, aloof gods. In Hispania, modern-day Spain and Portugal, Heracles was said to have founded Cadiz. The Pillars of Hercules, those two mythical rocks on either side of the Strait of Gibraltar, marked the edge of the known world. Non plus ultra, they said, nothing further beyond. A neat reminder that even the strongest man in legend had limits. And then, perhaps inevitably, Heracles passed into story. As the Roman Empire waned, Christianity rose. And like many pagan figures, Heracles was gently repurposed, not entirely discarded, but no longer worshipped. In medieval texts, he appeared not as a god, but as a cautionary tale. A strong man, yes, but one undone by pride, or lust, or wrath. The same traits that once made him heroic now made him tragic. Still, he would not disappear. In the Renaissance, that great rebirth of classical knowledge, Heracles came roaring back. Artists painted him with glowing skin, rippling muscles, eyes cast upward in stoic determination. Writers invoked him in Latin verse. Philosophers used him to argue for the nobility of struggle. Michelangelo sculpted him. Rubens painted him. In Florence, he became a civic symbol. The the strong man who defends the city from chaos. A very localized Hercules, you might say, complete with Florentine fashion and political nuance. In the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers adopted him again, this time as a symbol of reason triumphing over superstition. The Hydra became ignorance. The stables became the corrupt institutions of church and state. The metaphor evolved, but the shape remained. And then, in the 20th century, something altogether different happened. Hercules went to Hollywood. He was played by bodybuilders, by Italians in sandals, by the occasional animated demigod with a singing satyr for a sidekick. He appeared in comics, in cereal commercials, in gym names. His strength became a marketing tool, his labours a convenient plot device. And yet, even there, beneath the muscle, the cheese, the fanfare, something of the old Hercules remained. He was still flawed, still funny, still, in his way, trying to do the right thing. He became whatever each era needed. A god in Egypt, a hero in Rome, a saintly sufferer in Byzantium, a cartoon in California. His adaptability is his power. Not just his strength, but his resonance. The way he fits into every age, because he is, at heart, not just divine, but recognisably human. A man who made mistakes, who lost his temper, who regretted things, who tried to fix them, who sometimes succeeded and sometimes didn't. In this way, Heracles has become not just a myth, but a mirror. We see in him the best of us, and, at times, the worst. We see the burdens we carry, and the hope that we might one day put them down. We see the struggle, the exhaustion, the final rest. So when we say Heracles around the world, we are not merely mapping the places he touched. We are tracking the ways he continues to matter. In philosophy, in art, in quiet metaphors we don't always realise we're using. To call someone Herculean is to name them strong, yes, but also determined, dogged, capable of facing the thing no one else will face. And that, perhaps, is the truest legacy of all. Not the temples, not the films, not the myths carved in fading marble, but the idea that strength is not about being untouched by hardship, but about facing it anyway, quietly, relentlessly, kindly. So wherever you are tonight, be it under electric light or ancient stars, know that the man who once wrestled giants now waits gently in your story too. And maybe, when things feel too heavy to lift, you'll remember him. And try anyway. Rest now, listener. The world can wait. The next labour begins in the morning. Tonight, you sleep. Stories end, but not all at once. Some fade gently, like candlelight at the bottom of a glass. Others echo for so long they forget how to stop. And some, a rare few, keep walking long after the last sentence has been spoken. Hercules, or Heracles, as he was first named, is one such story. He began, as many Greek heroes did, in contradiction. Part god, part man. Born of an illicit affair between Zeus and a mortal woman. Hated by the queen of the gods before he could even speak. Loved by many, feared by more, and tasked with redeeming himself through deeds so difficult they have never been forgotten. We followed him through it all. The snake in the cradle, the labours that pushed the edge of the world, the moment of madness, the wrestling matches with river gods and monsters and grief itself, the poisoned robe, the flames, the ascent, the uneasy peace. But even after 10 chapters and thousands of words, the question lingers. Why does he endure? Not just in temples and textbooks, not just in the pages of epic poems or the flickering frames of Saturday morning cartoons, but in us. Why is Hercules still here? in our metaphors, our gyms, our dreams, our quiet inner dialogues. It is not, I think, because of his strength. Strength is everywhere in myth. Titans held up the sky. Cyclopes hurled boulders. Achilles was swift. Odysseus was clever. Theseus was brave. But Hercules was different, not for what he could do, but for what he had to do. And, more importantly, for what he endured doing it. The Greeks never pretended Heracles was perfect. He was impulsive, unpredictable. He killed when he shouldn't have. He wept when others might not have. He begged for help. He made mistakes and spent years paying for them. And yet, despite all of it, he kept going. That, more than the lion skin or the club, is the true shape of his legacy: perseverance. The Greeks had a word for this: karteria, endurance, the ability to suffer well, to bear the unbearable, to carry your guilt on your back like a sack of stones and still climb the mountain, to scrub stables when the stench is overwhelming, to battle hydras knowing they only grow more heads, to take on tasks you didn't ask for, to clean up the mess left by others, and to do so not because it will make you famous, but because it needs to be done. Heracles became a vessel for these ideas. He was not the hero of victory. He was the hero of effort. The Stoics saw this clearly. For them, he was not just muscle. He was moral fibre. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, doesn't name Heracles directly, but you can feel him in the emperor's tone. You must build up your life action by action, he writes, and be content if each one achieves its goal as far as possible, and no one can keep you from this. That, in essence, is the life Heracles lived. Not clean, not easy, not without error, but persistent. And in persistence, something divine, even in death, or apotheosis, depending on your view. Heracles didn't settle into stillness. He wasn't transformed into some aloof, distant deity, drifting on clouds, sipping ambrosia in bored omnipotence. He remained active, invoked, present. In Thebes, athletes poured oil over altars in his name. Wrestlers rubbed their arms and whispered prayers to him. Soldiers drew his lion's head on their shields, not because they expected invincibility, but because they needed courage. Traders left offerings before long journeys. Even ordinary people, those not kings or warriors or philosophers, saw in him someone who knew what it was to toil. There is comfort in that. To imagine that a figure so mighty still understood hardship, that even gods once had to suffer through long days and difficult choices, that the divine could emerge not just from miracles, but from repetition, from resilience. He also changed over time. That too is part of his strength. He became what people needed him to be. To the Greeks, he was the flawed mortal trying to be better. To the Romans, he was the empire's brawny cousin, civilized and assured. To the Christians of late antiquity, he became a sort of pagan penitent, one who suffered for past sins and emerged transfigured. In the Renaissance, he returned as the ideal man, strong of body, bold of spirit, occasionally nude in marble but always upright. In the modern world, he became the archetype of the hero's journey. Trials, growth, triumph, even when the names had changed. He was Gilgamesh, Beowulf, Frodo, Luke Skywalker. Every character who begins unready suffers, fails, learns, and somehow, scarred but wiser, prevails. You've seen him, even when you haven't noticed. He's there in the firefighter pushing through smoke, in the parent working 2 jobs, in the student pulling another all-nighter, hoping for a future that feels just out of reach. in the addict trying again, in the heartbroken healing slowly. He is not just in the mighty, he is in the struggling, and he has always been. Because Hercules, as myth, speaks not to our fantasies, but to our exhaustion. He tells us, yes, it is hard. Yes, you have made mistakes. Yes, you are tired, but go on anyway. Do the next labour. Wrestle the next beast. Clean the next stable. Try again. And if you fail, well, even Hercules failed sometimes. The ancient Greeks, for all their dramatics, understood this quietly. Their temples to him were often built on roadsides, at crossroads, at city gates, places where travellers passed through, burdened by distance, by trade, by fear. They prayed not just to be strong, but to keep going. They left offerings of oil and muscle balm and simple food. They asked for patience, for courage, for rest, and not just in Greece, along Roman roads, in the forums of Spain and Gaul, on the windswept borders of Britannia. His name travelled not with spectacle, but with quiet reliance. He became a sort of spiritual companion, the god not of thunder, but of the weary nod at the end of the day. It's telling, I think, that Hercules never became the god of conquest, not of war, not of kingship, but of effort, of survival, of the weary hero who just kept going. There's something deeply human in that. Even his apotheosis, his becoming a god, is not portrayed as glory but as release. He is not swept into the heavens by chariots and trumpets. He burns. His mortal flesh stripped away by pain, revealing divinity not as a crown, but as the quiet core that remained when everything else was gone. He becomes, in the end, the man he was always meant to be. Not perfect, but whole. And so, as this story closes, you might wonder what remains. Not the monsters. Those are gone. Not the labours. Those were his. What remains is the idea. The idea that we can face things, even when they seem impossible. That strength is not measured in glory, but in effort. That you don't have to be a god to matter. You just have to keep going. And sometimes, stop. Lay down your burdens. Rest by the fire. Eat, drink, sleep. Hercules would understand. He, more than anyone, earned his sleep. And now, so have you. So close your eyes, dear listener. Let the world fall away. The labours are behind you. The lion is long tamed, the serpents silenced, the arrows spent. You are not broken. You are not behind. You are simply becoming. As he did, as we all do, and in that long, slow unfolding. You are not alone. The stars remember him, and they remember you too. Good night, hero. Sleep well.